Good evening and welcome to this Stride workshop, part of Positive East Staying Together. Tonight we're joined by Shaun Dellenty. He's a London-based educator, presenter, writer and multi-award-winning anti-bullying advocate and speaker on positive LGBT inclusion in education and communities. He's worked in a variety of educational contexts in London and rural communities. Based on his own experiences of systemic homophobia as a child, Shaun devised Inclusion for All, aiming to train teachers on inclusion and to raise awareness of diverse identities. He's since gone on to speak on bullying and prejudicial behaviour at an extensive range of primary and secondary schools, teaching training establishments, faith schools, local authorities, police and anti-bullying organisations, including Amnesty International, National College of Teacher and Leadership, NSPCC, Kidscape and many, many more. Shaun's also been the feature of numerous articles in the national press, including Times Educational Supplement, Huffington Post, The Guardian, Evening Standard and The Mirror. He's a prolific writer and blogger, and he's written articles for Teach Primary Magazine, The Guardian, Gay Star News, Gay Times and many others. Shaun's also judged the International Young Journalist of the Year Award for Amnesty, and he continues to support this organisation in the LGBT aspect of their teacher training programme and the development of educational resources. He's advised on policy at the House of Commons of Lords. He's also advised on policy at party and cross-party conferences. And in May 2016, Shaun was honoured with 3 major awards, including being designated a point of light at a special ceremony at 10 Downing Street by then UK Prime Minister David Cameron for services to the LGBT and education communities. Shaun's first book, For Bloomsbury Education, Celebrating Difference, A Whole School Approach to LGBT Inclusion, was published in 2019, marking Shaun's 10th year of work in the field. Shaun, good evening.
Good evening.
It's great to have you with us. I know you sent me the bio. I cut a lot out because if I read out all your accolades, we wouldn't have any time left for your presentation.
So we'd probably be asleep as well.
What a career. Can you tell us what's been the highlight of your career, Shaun?
It's something to do with the Isle of Man, which is in my presentation. So I'm not going to tell you any more.
Very, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, then. So you've written your book, Celebrating Difference. I know that that's been endorsed by lots of celebrities and LGBT figures. How's it going?
It's going really well, actually. It's funny, when you release a book, I'd never released a book before. And I thought it would be like releasing a single where it kind of would have an impact instantly. And actually it doesn't. It kind of, particularly as it's an education book, it kind of ripples out slowly. So the initial launch was brilliant. We did that in the West End. And obviously it was recommended in the House of Lords by Lord Cashman, even before it had come out. But what's happened since then is it's kind of rippled out to universities, into the media. And just today, actually, I've heard that it's been longlisted for an award. And it's been out a while now. So to be longlisted at this point is a real surprise, actually. But, you know, I wrote it from the heart. And if it makes a difference to one child in one school, happy days. That's all I can ask, really.
Fantastic. Can I ask you, who is the book for?
Well, although it's called A Whole School Approach to LGBT plus Inclusion, because by the time I'd written it, I'd worked in lots of different schools, but I'd also worked with, I do a lot of diversity talks for big global corporations like HSBC over at Canary Wharf. I did one the other day for Taylor Wimpey that build houses, and yesterday a big tech company that's across most of the world. And through doing that work, I've also kind of gained a sense of what diversity and inclusion leads need in business as well. And actually, whether it's a school or a business or another sort of organization, for me, the journey is the same. It's a journey of personal, cultural change leading to a change within the ethos of the organization. So it is a book for schools, but it's also a book for business diversity leads as well.
Well, fantastic. Well, I wish you every ongoing success with that.
Thank you.
So tonight you've come to talk to us about Section 28 and your view that we need to be concerned about sort of the political arena for LGBT people throughout the country. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So, you know, as I'll kind of talk about in my presentation, Section 28 was a big part of my childhood and people of my generation's childhood. And it was not a positive force whatsoever. And what really struck me when I started my own work, which was back in 2009, although Section 28 was repealed in this country in 2003, it was like it was still there in schools, and particularly in primary schools. And the first time I kind of talked about doing anything around LGBT plus inclusion in schools, people kind of put their heads down and went, we'll lose our jobs, it's against the law. And that was 2009. So it left this huge shadow. And then I guess maybe up to about 3 years ago, it really did feel, with the work that I've done and other people working in this field, you know, that we'd kind of started to move out of that shadow, out of that cloud. And then things started to move back the other way. And now I've got real concerns, which I'll outline a bit later on. So yeah, but as you know, you said in the introduction, Greg, when there's progress, inevitably that's not linear, and inevitably people get scared about that progress, and they think as the spotlight of awareness is raised on one community, that somehow their spotlight is being faded down, which is absolutely not the intention, and they start to get fearful and panicky, and I think that's what's happening. And I knew it would happen, to be honest. I thought we'd be at this point again, but it's not great, and it's worrying. It's deeply worrying, actually.
Yeah, I agree. So, Shaun, can you tell us what you've got to tell us? I'm really fascinated by hearing what you've got for us tonight.
Of course. Thank you very much. And thanks to Positive East for having me here to speak tonight. And thank you to those of you that are here now, and to those of you that listen to this presentation in future. So I'm just going to hold my breath and try and share my slides. This always makes me slightly nervous, so feel free to talk amongst yourselves at this point. There we go. So hello everybody, really nice to meet you. As you know, my name is Shaun Dellenty. I'm on Twitter. I'm at Shaun Dellenty if you'd like to follow or tweet. I also have a website, shaundellenty.com, with more information there about my work and the impact of my work. So my pronouns are he, him, and his. And let's get going. So Greg's has actually given a really comprehensive introduction, so I'm not going to go through any of this at all, but I think just the top bullet point, really. I've been in education since 1996, although I started training in 1992. And I trained as a class teacher, primary school teacher, then became a school leader, so a deputy head and an acting head in primary phase. I was also working as a school governor. And then for a couple of days a week, I was actually seconded out of my school to work as what's called a school improvement consultant. And that was across the borough of Southwark. And really, it was through doing that work. That was a lot of training and a lot of delivering conferences and introducing new materials. And it was really there that I developed the skills that I then applied to LGBT plus inclusion in schools, for reasons that will become clear. I also worked in other jobs. I was a professional actor. I've still got my equity card, and a presenter, and I worked as a civil servant and a few of those random jobs that we do when we're trying to pay our way. I also volunteer for Opening Doors London. You may know of them. They help support LGBT plus people who are over 50 to live happy, sociable and independent lives. And of course, the whole experience that we've all been through over the last year or so has been very challenging and brought with it unique challenges and continues to do so. And for many LGBT plus people and young people, but also 50 plus people, it was incredibly isolating. And I don't think we'll really start to understand the full impact of these times until we really kind of move ahead from them, to be honest. So I speak to you at the very end of LGBT plus Pride Month. And this is actually my last LGBT plus Pride Month talk. So it's a real privilege to be delivering it to Positive East. Throughout this month, I've delivered a wide range of talks to schools, businesses, online in the main because of COVID. But I did get up to Scotland and deliver talks there, which was lovely. And I've delivered talks across the UK, across India, the Americas, Europe, Middle East and African countries as well, online, of course. So this is my final talk. So it's really exciting and a privilege to be delivering it to you all. And of course, Pride Month, the other day was the 52nd anniversary of the raid on the Stonewall Bar in New York City. in 1969, which resulted in riots and protests throughout the city. And as is well documented now, although of course there are many different accounts that don't always align about exactly what happened that night, but we could probably agree that Stonewall sparked a shift and an increase in LGBT plus activism. And of course, our histories are often not told or even actively erased, as is the case with other minority groups. So of course, there were other people and groups of people that spoke out, that took action and protested in America, but also in other countries around the world whose stories may never be known. Even in America, prior to Stonewall, there was the Compton's Cafeteria riot, if we want to use that word, which was in response to police harassment of drag queens and trans people. And that was actually in 1966. So what's Pride about? Well, for me, this is my personal take on it. It's about community. It's about coming together, because I believe we're stronger together. It's about visibility, of course. It's about tackling erasure. It's about raising awareness. It's about education. It's about active and authentic allyship. So it's not just about making a sandwich with a rainbow on it and then doing nothing else for the rest of the year. It's about making oppressed voices heard. It's around, as I've said, addressing erasure of LGBT plus identities, histories, and the contributions that we make to society and have done over many, many years. And for me, Pride in London was actually where I finally accepted myself as a gay man. That was in 1996. I wouldn't come to Pride for years. I now realize that was because of internalized homophobia. But once I got over myself and worked through that, I finally accepted an invitation to come. And I remember coming out of the tube station at Green Park, walking out onto the street, seeing thousands and thousands of beautifully diverse LGBT plus people and their allies, and bursting into tears. And just suddenly something went, and I accepted myself as myself fully for the first time. So I would want anybody to be able to have that experience. And of course, LGBT plus people, we talk about them in Pride Month, we talk about them in LGBT plus History Month, but we should be talking about them every single minute of every single day throughout every aspect of our schools, our businesses, and our organizations. Because LGBT plus people can be scientists, they can be performers, creatives, they can help develop vaccines and help administer vaccines. They can be web and app developers, lawyers, health workers, and so on and so on. Of course they can. They can be all these things and more if they are allowed to be, if they are enabled to be by affirmative environments. And by that, I mean homes, families, the next door neighbours, the neighbourhoods in which they live are safe and accepting. The education systems that they study through, and the health systems that they access. Public spaces like libraries, swimming pools, gyms, online platforms, clubs, friendship and social groups, faith communities, workplaces, and yes, legal systems. These all need to be affirmative environments if we are going to be able to achieve our full potential as individuals and as the LGBT plus community. But I'm sure some of you listening and watching this presentation will be fully aware, as am I, that too often some, possibly all of these environments are not affirmative for some people. Just a little bit of my life story, really, just to give you a bit of context to the chronology of the rest of this presentation. I had to think, 53 years old. I was born in 1968. This is my first school photo. There I am in the middle, sandwiched by two men that I absolutely fell in love with when I was the age that this picture was taken. My parents took me to see a James Bond film called Dr. No with Sean Connery, not Daniel Craig, as James Bond. And when I saw Sean Connery, I thought, he's going to be my future husband. And if he's not, the one in ABBA with the beard, Benny, the person on the left in this picture, he will be my future husband. Now, I'd made no choice to be like that. No one had asked me or forced me to be like that. That's just who I was. And yes, it's still who I am. And I'm really proud about that at the age of 53. But I wasn't always proud about it. I had to go on a journey. And the reason for that was a lack of affirmative environments. And that stopped me, prevented me from being proud about myself from the start, which is what I would wish for every naturally diverse human being. Secondary school, I went to secondary school in a town called Lutterworth, which is about 15 miles outside Leicester. At secondary school, I was really very badly bullied for being me, the me that I'd had no choice over being. And I was bullied on a regular basis. It was daily, and it was by my peers, it was by some of the teachers, and my parents were pretty prejudiced, in fact, very prejudiced, to be honest, at that point, because we've got a good relationship now. So I didn't feel that I could reach out and get help at home from my teachers, because they were part of the problem. And I didn't want to tell any of my friends that I was being homophobically bullied, because I was worried about being outed and my parents finding out and rejecting me. And that was a very real possibility. So over time, over the years that I was at secondary school, when I should have been concentrating on my studies and my exams, instead I was concentrating on getting out of bed in the morning, just trying to get up, you know, wash myself, those kind of things. And that led to me trying to change myself by compromising the clubs that I went to, the activities that I did, the way that I laughed, the way that I spoke, the way that I sat. I became really difficult to teach. It affected my behavior. I started to miss a lot of school because I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel I belonged. My parents ultimately did find out I was gay and talked about taking me for conversion therapy. And there was no way I was going to have electric shocks stuck in me, because it would have played havoc with my hair, quite frankly. I'm not having that. So I needed to kind of get out of school and get out of home as quickly as I could. I had no relevant whatsoever sex and relationships education. And that left me very vulnerable to HIV and non-consensual sex. So in the end, I just gave up. I thought, what's the point in learning to live in a world that's telling me I deserve to die of AIDS, that I'm unnatural, that I'll go to hell? And so I stopped going. And ultimately, I came very close to taking my own life, but I didn't. And I'm glad I didn't, because it means that I'm here to speak to all of you wonderful people today. But I'm one of the lucky ones. And 11 years of working in this field have shown me with tremendous clarity that I'm one of the lucky ones. And of course, it continues to have lifelong effects. When I left school, I didn't leave it there. I carried it within me for many years, and it affected my relationships, it affected my sexual relationships, and it affected my work as well. And in the end, it was really through therapy that I was able to put all of that into a suitcase and lock it and turn around and face a brighter future, which is what I would want for everybody that has these kind of experiences. And of course, all this took place at secondary school in the early 1980s. HIV, AIDS, or GRID as I first knew it, came into this country around 1982. And of course, at that point, you know, if we think about the onset of COVID last year, how frightening that was, it was very reminiscent of this time in terms of not knowing everything about this virus. It was very frightening. And of course, schools were not talking about it, and they weren't talking about it because of something called Section 28. And Section 28 was a piece of legislation introduced by the government of Margaret Thatcher, which shut down conversations in schools about LGBT plus identities and HIV and AIDS to a majority extent, really. Now, there's a record of these times in a film that I contributed to called After 82. It's a documentary about the arrival of HIV and AIDS, with interviews with many of the people that were there at the time. And it's free, I believe, on Amazon Prime, or if it's not, it's only a couple of pounds. It's very moving. It's well worth your time. It's well worth watching it. And of course, into the COVID experience last year, when COVID arrived into the country, it came into my family very quickly. In fact, even before we'd locked down in London, my brother and his entire family caught COVID near to Cheltenham racecourses. And suddenly I was having conversations with my family, and my mother, and my parents and my brother about viral loads and about being positive and negative. And unexpectedly, that really stirred stuff up for me. And I know I wasn't alone in this. It stirred up a lot of stuff from the 1980s, and particularly difficult to cope with was the prompt, or reasonably prompt, reaction once they got themselves in order by the government to COVID and the general populace wanting something done. And that stood in stark contrast to the experiences of those suffering with AIDS in the 1980s. And that brought up a lot of anger, if I'm honest. And then interestingly, into that space then fell It's a Sin by Russell T Davies. And that almost became a way for me, and having spoken to some of my friends, for them as well, a way of kind of working through some of those feelings. And what was great about the timing of that was it kind of, because of the virus that was going on in the present, I think it enabled a greater sense of empathy in those that were experiencing a virus now, to be able to look back to what we'd gone through in the early 80s. So I think that's a good thing. It's certainly got conversations going. And just another note on that, on the 14th of July on Radio 4 at 9 a.m. in the morning, repeated afterwards, I've contributed to a program called Soul Music, which is a Radio 4 program about specific pieces of music, songs. One of them is Small Town Boy by Bronski Beat. And in that program, provided they haven't cut me out, I don't think they have, because there's my name on the website, I talk about the Vauxhall Tavern, I talk about the onset of HIV and AIDS and the impact that music had upon me in the early 1980s in terms of giving me a sense of connection with the LGBT plus community via music. Now, another way in schools these days, in the present, that we connect with the LGBT plus community is by using books about diverse families and diverse relationships. And this is a selection that I compiled a few years ago. There's a very famous book about gay penguins you may have heard here called Untango Makes Three, that's banned in a lot of schools in America, but it's just about gay penguins and children love it. But it's quite common now to have books like this in schools in this country. In fact, they should be in every school. But Section 28 was in part inspired by a reaction to a 1983 storybook, which just aimed to give children information about different types of diverse families, because even then, you know, there were diverse families. It was called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, and the Daily Mail, of course, said it was, let's save the children from these sad, sordid sex lessons, despite the fact there was no sex in it. It's their minds that take it to bedroom level. A bizarre truth about happy family in the gay school book. And Kenneth Baker, who was then the education secretary, said this was a grossly offensive homosexual propaganda that had been put into libraries by left-wing authorities. And really that kind of gives you an indication of the culture of fear around that time. Section 28 was enacted in May 1988, and it sought to prohibit the promotion, hold that word for a minute, the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities overseeing social care and schools. It represented state-sponsored homophobia, and it absolutely did. Very famously, this clip is on YouTube. It makes my stomach turn when I see it to this day. Margaret Thatcher at the conference said, children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. You see, the words don't even want to come out of my mouth, which of course is just utter baloney, because you know, we know who we are from a very early age, and many children have LGBT plus family members and parents, and they deserve to know that they are welcome and included in our schools and our communities. Now, Section 28, after a lot of protests, quite rightly, was repealed in Scotland in 2000 and the rest of England in 2003. But the damage it caused, as I said earlier on, should never be forgotten, and it leaves a toxic shadow. I said, hold that word, promotion. I've been going into hundreds of schools around the world for the last 11 years to talk about LGBT plus inclusion. Never once have I gone into a school, nor would I, to promote being LGBT plus or becoming LGBT plus. I don't know how you do that anyway. I think nature does that very nicely for us. But that word promotion, which is a scaremongering word, has stuck. And you may remember there were some demonstrations outside a school in Birmingham a few years ago around LGBT plus inclusive sex and relationships education. The word promotion appeared on the banners, and it's commonly used in the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail, in also countries such as Hungary and Poland and Chechnya that are pushing back on LGBT plus identities, and particularly in schools, by claiming it's propaganda or promotion. It's not. It's information and education about the simple fact that LGBT plus people exist, have lives, histories, pay taxes, and make societal contributions. So let's leave the word promotion where it belongs, in the trash. And these are some memoirs, I suppose, from some some of my friends actually, who very kindly shared their own experiences. So this gives you a break from my lived experience. This is my friend Mark, who is my age. I was bullied the whole of my secondary schooling. Teachers heard and did nothing. We had no sex education about being gay. It was an all-boys school with girls in the sixth form. I went to a gay youth group at 18 and I didn't understand why there were condoms in a bowl. I had no idea about safe sex with men. It's taken me years for me to be okay with who I am as a gay man. I spent from ages 13 to 18 knowing I was gay, but with no education and information to show me it was okay to be that way. I still now, not as much as in my 20s, feel being gay is less than wrong, as opposed to being straight. And that really, just reading that makes me want to cry, that one of my friends would still feel like that at this age after all this time. But there is the damage that was done. Mary, I worked as a primary school teacher, leader in the 1980s under Section 28. Not only did I have to conceal my own authentic identity and long-term relationship, but I also couldn't fully support the young people in school who were clearly LGBT plus emergent. I'm a bit of a rebel and did little things where and when I could, as I felt it was my duty as a school leader. I remember a local authority representative telling me to pipe down and back off when I asked him what more we could do to prevent homophobic bullying in language. A lot of it linked to the onset of HIV and AIDS, of course, and fueled by the press. Some of my staff worried parents might complain and they could lose their jobs. Such was the culture of fear created by Section 28. And of course, that culture of fear wasn't just a culture of fear, it had very real ramifications with a virus that initially was hitting the LGBT plus community very hard. So it wasn't just about shutting conversations down, it was about putting people's lives at risk. And Liam, things were totally different then. As a young gay man, I was 21 in 1988. I was struggling to come to terms with my sexuality. I had not yet come out and was petrified to do so. I was from a small town, at a university in a small northern city, and I had no gay friends. The HIV/AIDS epidemic was ravaging the gay community, and government advertising warned me simply that if I dared embrace my sexuality, the inevitable consequence would be my death. Thatcher claimed we were being cheated of a sound start in life, but it was her government cheating us. Section 28 felt like the clock was turning back to 67, the year of my birth, when it was illegal to be gay. We were unpersoned, treated differently under the law, persecuted and vilified by society at large, not to be discussed or even acknowledged by public authorities, merely left in a quiet corner where we could die as a result of our nature. Section 28 was what finally pushed me to come out. I was so viscerally horrified, I could no longer contain my unhappiness and began to tell people I was gay, regardless of the risk. So thank you to all of those people that have shared that quite painful lived experience. Now, in 1974, the Gay Teachers Association had actually started. So I'm certainly not the first person to undertake work in schools, and they later became Schools Out, who is still going. Stonewall, of course, was founded as a professional lobbying group in response to Section 28. And there were mass protests by LGBT plus campaigners and their allies, and many teachers too, actually, against Section 28. And very famously, in 1988, I was watching it at the time, the evening news on the BBC was gate crashed by lesbian protesters against Section 28, and all power to them. And in February 1988, Stop the Clause march in Manchester city centre. It was one of the largest LGBT plus demonstrations ever held in the UK. So for all of the people who contributed to the repeal of Section 28 during this Pride Month, although it's the end of Pride Month, we honour them. We owe them a debt of gratitude. And it's important that we learn from the past as we move into the future by finding our own voices and using our own voices. So now a little bit about my professional story. You've heard a little bit about my childhood story, but what happened when I was an adult? Well, I went back to school. I trained ultimately as a teacher once I'd got my exams. And by November 2009, I was a primary school leader in London, just opposite Canary Wharf in the Rotherhithe Peninsula. Very diverse school, very inclusive school, very successful school. But then just before Christmas in 2009, we did some student voice questionnaires, some surveys, if you like. When we got that data, to my horror, it showed us that 75% of our primary school pupils were experiencing homophobic and bullying language every single day, whether or not they identified as LGBT+. So some of them were, and they were being bullied for that, that many of them were just being bullied with homophobic language because they had the wrong haircut, wrong trainers, wrong mobile phone, or maybe they were a boy, they didn't like football, or maybe they were a boy and they liked Frozen the musical, something like that. Or maybe they were a girl and they liked certain sports and they were being called leather and all of that as a result. But 0% of our whole staff, including myself, had ever had any professional conversations around LGBT plus inclusion. So what do you do? And I actually reached out to organizations like Stonewall at that point and said, do you do training in primary schools about this? And they went, no. And I thought, that's odd, why not? And they said, if you do it in primary schools, you'll be accused of being a paedophile and you'll end up in the Daily Telegraph and Daily Mail. And I thought, okay. And I'm gay as well, so they're probably going to go for that. But I was a serving school leader. And as a serving school leader, you have a duty of care to keep your young people safe and validated and included so they can go on and have brilliant lives and be well educated. So had I ignored that data, I really didn't deserve my job. So I had to do something about it. So in the absence, in the vacuum of training that was available, I wrote my own training program called Inclusion for All. And to do it, I asked myself this question. When I was at school myself, where, when, and how did I learn about heterosexual lives, histories, and experiences? And of course, it was everywhere, all of the time, but it was never labeled as heterosexual. It was just presented as the norm, heteronormativity. So I took that training and delivered it in my own school in January 2010. It went very well. I then started ringing up and bothering other London schools to see if they wanted it. And very quickly, I found myself delivering it across London, then across England, and then across the UK. And now I've delivered it across 25 countries. And some of the things that I said at the time, which to me are just like obvious things, just stuff that I would say, because to me, they feel very normal to say, ended up kind of repeated in the paper. And I remember seeing this on the side of a van that drove past me once, on an Evening Standard van with my face on it. And I thought, why is that such a big deal to say something like that? You're just saying, can we treat people kindly and nicely? But even in 2009, it was this kind of cause for a headline. I also came out at work at that time because I wanted the young people in my school to know what homophobic bullying had nearly done to me when I was at school, to make it real. So I came out. And actually, although I knew that there were other gay primary school leaders, I was the only one that would talk to the press at that time. So the Times Educational Supplement came to me and said, no one else will talk to us, will you? And I went, okay. So I did. And I kind of was widely reported at the time as that gay teacher. And you couldn't get rid of me, to be honest. I was sick of the sound of my own voice because I was the only high profile out gay primary school leader. I'm happy to say now there are lots more. We've gone on a journey and that's brilliant. I was told that I shouldn't be doing this work in primary schools because children are too young to know, which is utter rubbish. Of course they're not. And ultimately that's led to other people picking up the mantle. So we now have Daniel Tomlinson Gray and LGB TED, who are a diversity network for out, or not just for out, but for LGBT teachers. They recently produced a book, Big Gay Adventures in Education, in which he remembers reading the articles about me way back then. So it just goes to show the impact we can have without even knowing it. Of course, all schools have a moral obligation to prevent LGBT plus bullying, and they also have obligations under the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act, Ofsted, and teacher standards. When I started doing this training in my own school, to my utmost surprise, and this really triggered my imposter syndrome, we started getting people ringing up from these big buildings in Canary Wharf going, we read about your training, can we come? And I went, it's for schools. It's for primary schools and secondary schools and faith schools. And they went, yeah, but you're talking about personal, cultural, and organizational change. And that's relevant to our organization. And this was kind of in the days where everybody was doing these 2-year diversity and inclusion roles that they're very, very trendy now. So they reached out and they came over and sat in on the training. A lot of them did. And then I started to go over and speaking in big buildings that looked like I was on The Apprentice and at big conferences and in Parliament. And again, I just had this huge imposter syndrome going on, but I did it because I was invited and I just shared my lived experience and people listened and it started to make change and it created more opportunities. And of course, now these big global corporations will often cite a report, Diversity Matters, by McKinsey, which is a very compelling business case for inclusive organizations. But for me, it's always been just a simple argument. If I'm managing people and they're being bullied, they're being excluded, they're on the receiving end of prejudice and bias, it's going to impact on their mental and physical health. It's going to affect their performance. They're not going to want to come to work, and ultimately that will affect business outcomes. As a teacher, if I allow bullying and prejudice and discrimination in my school, that is going to impact on young people in the same way, and that's going to hit their academic outcomes. For me, that is the argument for inclusive schools and organisations right there. And of course, within any business or any school, there are employees that are LGBT+. There are those that have LGBT+ friends and family, LGBT+ children. We work internationally, whether it's online or in person, and we will encounter LGBT+ people in society, media, and workplaces, and we have to prepare people for that. Of course, people might be out at work, they might not. So we need to watch what banter, there's a word, that we're using, because words can hurt. And of course, LGBT+ employees have identities that intersect with other equality strands. So it's about providing services in a way that promotes respect, dignity, and for everybody, not just for some stakeholders. I never had formal funding for my work. I don't have an organisation. I'm just me and my mouth. So I've never had formal funding. I've never had money for it. I've just had to use things that were free. So that's my mouth, my passion, and social media, and blogging and writing. And I have learned the power of your own voice once you find it, once you believe in it, to make change. I never planned this journey. It's a very unexpected journey, but it has made a difference, I'm told. It's even taken me to, as you heard, produce resources for Amnesty International. And earlier on, Greg kindly asked me what's been the highlight, what I'm most proud of. And I think it's this. I was asked to go and speak at a conference on the Isle of Man in 2016. I don't know if you know, but homosexuality was illegal there until 1992, and the Equality Act didn't phase in. It started phasing in from January 2018. And I think it's fair to say that the Isle of Man had a very complex history in terms of homophobia, particularly and relationships with gay men. There were some very, very damaged people on island, and a lot of people had left the island as a result of their experiences. I was invited to go and speak at a conference in 2016, at a diversity conference, the first ever international diversity conference on Ireland, surrounded by business speakers. And I was the only teacher there, so I spoke. And as a result of that, I was asked to then go and work with the entire Isle of Man Education Authority, all of the schools, all of the school leaders, lots of teachers, the youth services, the LGBT youth group, and take them on a journey of personal, cultural, and organisational change. So I did. And it was challenging. Sometimes I felt quite threatening at times, but I kept on and we got through it. And when I first arrived on Ireland, the LGBT youth group told me that they felt invisible, that no one spoke about them, that it was like they didn't exist, that if their parents found out, they could be dead. And they'd never heard a teacher even say the word gay or lesbian. And that was heartbreaking. It absolutely broke my heart to hear this. But just to sort of give you a sign of the journey we've been on, which has been a very moving and profound journey, and I'm deeply grateful for it. I ultimately ended up speaking to the government in their government, the Tynwald. The chief minister, who's their prime minister, came along. 25, I think, members of their parliament came along. And that has led to Isle of Man Pride, which happened 2 weeks ago. That's the journey we've been on. And of course, other people made the Pride happen. I just sort of suggested that they do it. But it was about creating the space into which that could come. And unfortunately, I couldn't go because of COVID. So I sat and watched it online and cried the whole day, happy tears for them. And that work's brought me various awards. It's brought me into contact with people that I would never have expected to have come into contact with, such as the Mayor of London, who says education on LGBT+ is incredibly important. I've done work with the Church of England and other faith groups, and they agree that homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying causes damage. And as you heard, in 2016, I was given an award by the then Prime Minister. Please don't judge me on that picture. The award came from the Cabinet Office, really. I think he just handed it over, saying you're helping people to not face the despicable prejudice that you and many others had to face. And just before the lockdown, the first lockdown, I was in Mumbai, starting some work in India, and I hope to go back as soon as I can. And for me, this work is about listening to people, valuing their lived experience, meeting them as they are, When you're working across different territories, it's finding cross-cultural entry points, showing cultural humility, and it's about giving people what they need in order to succeed. I found my voice. These are some ideas for how you can find your voice. Please use your voice. We need to hear it now more than ever. That's the book I wrote, Celebrating Difference, a Whole School Approach to LGBT plus Inclusion. It's on Amazon. It's available on iTunes. There's Lord Cashman's recommendation for it, which is a huge privilege that one of my childhood role models, teenage role models, would recommend a book that I'd written. And it's very much structured around a journey of personal, cultural, and organizational change, starting with how we feel about other people. Just because we're LGBT plus people, or might be, doesn't mean that we don't have prejudices and our own bias. It doesn't mean we don't have resistance to human diversity. So we need to own that and work with it. And of course, around the year, there are many opportunities for awareness raising days, weeks, months, that we can all just bring up the spotlight of awareness on different communities, hopefully in an intersectional way, where we look at how our identities intersect. So what have I learned? Well, I've learned that people aren't labels. Behind the LGBT plus, there are complex, holistic, 3D rounded human beings. We have to be patient with people. We have to seek allies. There's a lot of suffering out there, particularly right now. We need to bring compassion and be empathetic, but also be courageous to be compassionate. And we need to be hopeful. I gained more hope in my life when I was able to get married to Mike, my husband, at the Houses of Parliament in 2016, in the shadow of Big Ben. That's something under Section 28 I thought I would never be able to do. So that gave me hope, as did these cards from my primary school pupils on our wedding day. You see, we're not born prejudiced, we learn it, thanks to them. So my final thoughts, I'm putting up a red flag at this point, because having been in this work for 11 years now, I thought we'd left the shadow of Section 28 behind for a while, but it's coming back. And I know it's coming back through my work, certain levels of my work, should I say, that bring me into contact with certain people and organizations high up. And I know that there is an absolute pushback on certain elements of LGBT plus inclusion, and particularly in schools. So it's really important that we find our voice and use it, and don't take things for granted, because things can change very quickly. Just look at America, just look at Hungary and Poland. None of us are the first. I'm not the first person to do this work. I didn't start the conversation. We all stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and we can only hope to light the way for those of us who will follow. And sadly, I don't think we'll be the last generations striving for equality. No one owns the space of LGBT plus inclusion. It's a space that we should make inclusive for everybody to use their voice in. We're stronger together. And if there are identities within the LGBT plus spectrum that you don't get, it's about taking ownership of that and learning and bringing compassion. There are strategic attacks going on right now on social media, within the media, you know, the culture wars thing. It's coming from a very high place, and we are in a very difficult position right now. We need to be on our guard and be prepared to speak out and look back to those who protested in the times of Section 28 and at Stonewall, and learn from them, because we may need to deploy forms of protest as we move forward. And of course, all of this is taking place against a backdrop of the impact of COVID-19. And we often say LGBT plus people, but I tend to think of people who are LGBT plus. So these are ways that you can find your voice. Find your voice if you can, because we need you and we need allies too. So honor the past, look to the past and learn from it, but tell your story in order to shape a better future for us all. And for people like Mark, there will be kids just like him in schools all over the country wondering if they're wrong, alone, why they're different. And by simply showing them these experiences exist, it shows them they're not alone, not wrong. It doesn't make someone gay or trans by educating kids about it any more than it makes a kid want to become Henry VIII. I'm Shaun Dellenty. It's been a privilege and a pleasure speaking and delivering this presentation. I hope you find it useful and engaging and enjoyable. I hope it makes you think, and I hope it makes you want to find your voice. You can follow me and comment on Twitter. There's my website. I'm on Facebook, Shaun Dellenty Celebrating Difference. I'm on YouTube, and I'm on Instagram as well. And most of all, I just want to say, again, happy Pride Month. A huge thank you to Positive East and to you for watching this session. whoever you are and however you identify, be kind to yourselves and other people. Be safe, especially now. Be proud. And whoever you are, I hope that you are free to be you, authentically you. Take care. Love and light. Thank you.